20% of you, 1 in 5 Americans, lives in either Texas or California. California is the biggest state, Texas is second. And California is the dream for many Americans. Those beautiful beaches, movie stars, great weather. Its population grew at more than double the national average until 1990. Then something changed. Last decade, 2 million more Americans moved out of California than moved in. Many moved to other states like Texas. In the last decade, Texas's population grew at double the national rate. And one of those new Texans is Chuck DeVore. He used to be a California politician. Now he's the author of The Texas Model, which argues that Texas governs better. Matt Welch of Reason magazine also moved from California, but his magazine is still based there. So why is that? If you're getting out, California is so bad. Why is Reason magazine my favorite magazine in this horrible state?
Well, that's where we've been since 1971, and it informs thinking that gets us a little bit outside of the kind of Beltway, Acela track of thinking. But it's a challenge to be there, businesses, anyone, to stay in California these days. And you're exactly right to point out, it's a new thing in California. We no longer attract immigrants.
But, Chuck, there's still something thriving. There's the tech industry, the movie industry. Stuff is happening. And
absolutely. California does have a lot of assets. It has Silicon Valley. It does have Hollywood. It has the biotech industry. The problem is that you can't live off of those narrow bands of industry forever. And what's happening is that because of high taxes, big regulations, unhealthy lawsuit climate, and a lot of government spending, people are leaving the state.
It started in the 90s. Gray Davis said, we got all this cash from the dot-com boom. And well, tell me what happened.
Well, first of all, he spent the dot-com cash on public sector pension promises and just general spending to everybody. Even in the last 5 years of so-called austerity, spending has continued to go up.
Up beyond inflation and population growth.
Yes.
New thing, global warming measures.
For high-speed rail projects that no one needs, no one wants, yet will cost $68 billion.
And even Arnold, the Republican, the Terminator, I fell in love at one point. I thought, here's a politician quoting Milton Friedman. This is a guy who gets it. He'll make it better. What happened?
Well, what happened was he helped enact the largest tax increase in U.S. history at the state level in 2009. It was so bad that I resigned as chief Republican whip in the state assembly in protest of the tax increase.
And he also supported government funds to fund stem cell research. I talked to the guy pushing this once. He was a rich businessman. I said, you billionaires could pay for this by yourselves. Why is this a government job?
It was only a government job because people wanted to Democrats wanted to stick a thumb in the eye of George W. Bush, which is the same of their global warming emissions standard there. It's an expensive way to say we are not Republicans, we are Californians.
On borrowed money.
And a couple of years later, I read in the papers, oh, this organization has to be revamped. We suspect self-dealing, a conflict of interest. All this money is wasted. And yet now I read, I've balanced the budget, says the governor.
Yeah, well, they just passed by a ballot initiative one of the largest tax increases in history.
Tax the rich.
They've increased taxes by $50 billion. So, yes, suddenly it's going to look a lot more balanced there. But they're also lying. I mean, they're talking about revenue projections that will not come true. It's an annual tradition in California. Your budget looks balanced in January when you propose it, and then when the revenues actually start coming in, you say, oh, there's a shortfall. And that shortfall could be $8 billion. It has been as high as $30 billion in recent years. We'll see that happen again.
All right, Chuck, you've moved to Texas. You say this couldn't be a more interesting lab experiment. What do you mean?
Well, because the states are so similar, right? You have the biggest state and the second biggest state in population, the second and third biggest state in landmass. They're both demographically very diverse, more similar than different. They both are blessed with quite a few natural resources and a coastline with ports. And so with everything so similar on the surface, what you have to look at then is, why are the results so different? And of course the results are different because they're governed differently. Government at the state and local level consumes about a third more of the economy in California than it does in Texas. And that, with that extra government, you have things like 1/3 of the nation's welfare recipients are in California, even though they only have 1/8 of the population. You have more regulations, more taxes, everything.
We have a graph of the welfare recipients, the percentage of households receiving public assistance. Much higher in California than the U.S. average, and lower than average in Texas.
Absolutely.
But that just means you're starving poor people.
Well, not so. The cost of living in Texas is 42% less than the cost of living in California. And in point of fact, the U.S. Census Bureau has been criticized by Congress for 20 years for not taking into account cost of living. The fact that different states have different costs of living when it comes to housing and food and clothing.
And that's relevant when you look at the poverty rate. There was an old poverty rate measure where Texas lost to California. 16% of the people in California were in poverty, 17% in Texas. But now there's a new measure that includes the cost of living.
It does include the cost of living, and also includes some government benefits. And with this new measure that came out just 1 week after the election, what you see is that the state with the highest poverty rate in the nation is California, higher even than the District of Columbia. And that should really be a warning or a caution to progressives who maintain that this big government model is really the path to prosperity. We argue that it's entirely the opposite, that in fact Texas is a model for how America could be better run and there could be more prosperity by having less government.
There's been more job growth in Texas. Texas gained in the past 10 years more than 1 million jobs. California lost about 500,000 jobs. But Paul Krugman says in the New York Times, what's this Texas miracle? This is when Governor Perry was running for president. It's an unmiracle. The Texas unemployment rate was 8.2%. 8.2% isn't great, but California at the time was 11.8%.
California's had over 10% unemployment every month of Barack Obama's presidency until basically last November.
And it's still 3% higher than Texas.
Yes, and it's been higher in California than the national average every month since 1990.
Now, regulation. You're freer in Texas?
Oh, it's a huge difference. In fact, it was so bad in California that the Democrats allowed this law to be passed that sought to find the cost of regulations on small business. And when it came out, Governor Schwarzenegger was so embarrassed he didn't want it to come out. Finally, we pressured for it to come out. The cost on the average business in California for regulatory compliance is $133,000 per year.
The legislature passes, on average, around 900 bills a year. Laws. Here you go, Governor. 3 a day, or even 4 a day when they're in session. The Texas legislature, it's in session every 2 years, is that right?
Every 2 years for 140 days.
Right. They just don't have enough time. And the kind of laws that they're passing in California, they're saying you can't, as a parent, hire a psychiatrist to try to make your kid not gay. I mean, it's that level of crazy specificity. We're going to increase...
Michael, stay on that one for a moment, because I've covered these gay cure psychiatrists, and I think it's nonsense.
Sure.
But it should be your right to pursue something that we disagree with.
And it shouldn't be the right of the legislature to tell you what kind of things you need to do. And it's increasing the penalties, the fines, for throwing citrus onto a minor league baseball field. Seriously, that was a law passed a couple of years ago. This is the level of the way that legislatures there.
I didn't vote for it.
Yeah.
And if you're one of these big tech companies, Facebook or Google, you can navigate these regulations.
Well, you hire attorneys, you hire tax experts, you hire compliance experts that help navigate through this bureaucratic maze. A good example is if you want to build a strip mall. It takes, just to get permission to break ground and start construction, it takes 4 to 5 months on average in Texas. It takes 4 to 5 years on average in California, and that's one of the things that helps drive up the cost of housing and business complexes and factories in California.
All right, this is obvious to me looking from the outside. One works, the other doesn't work as well for its people. But the politicians are unfazed. What's that about?
Well, part of it is that you have a great home field advantage in California, which is that it's an awful nice place to live, especially along the coast. It's especially nice if you work in one of the highlight industries. And then everywhere else in the hinterlands, it's a lot of desperation, poverty, and population just leaking and running away. And so that part on the coast can generate incredible wealth, dynamism. It's fun as hell to work in those industries, right? But the rest of the state is having a much harder time.
And they don't have the political clout.
Well, there's another issue as well that comes into play in California, and that California is not a right-to-work state. They have very powerful unions, especially government unions. There's no counterpart to that in Texas. People are free to have their associations, and the unions aren't there to spend millions and millions of dollars to promote bigger government and higher taxes.